First two games of the Women's World Championship match have been played, and I want to take you through both of them. So let's cut straight to it. Wenjun, the reigning champion, was white in the first game. E4, C5. Okay, no big surprise from Zhongyi. She also plays E5, and as most Chinese players do, she plays the Petrov. But C5, the Sicilian, is in her repertoire. She varies her openings quite a bit, actually. And Wenjun goes for an open Sicilian. And after knight f6, well, instead of the normal knight c3, and then, well, quite possibly Scheveningen with d6, Wenjun plays bishop d3. That's a little bit unusual, but it has been seen in the past few years. I mean, it was always thought that basically knight c6 was a pretty reliable way for black to equalise. And I'm not sure I'd differ from that opinion, actually. I mean, in principle, this exchange is beneficial for black because it puts another pawn in the centre and allows black to play d5. And I mean, quite a few strong players have played like this with white, but I just don't believe it. It's just like one of those sort of modern quirks where people are trying to play something a little bit different. If castles, then just d5. Bishop f4 played by Zhu, and d5 anyway, and knight d2. So it's just a way of bringing the bishop out before knight d2 is played. So there's a little bit of tension in the middle. You know, it would be a mistake for black to take here because then this pawn could, on c6 is isolated, could become a little bit exposed. And white doesn't really want to take here because that'll just give black a big centre. So that's the tension in the position. Tan now plays g6. So there's a lot of holes in those dart squares, but there is quite a serious point to g6 actually. One can just play bishop e7 here, and that seems fine. But g6 is interesting because if white plays in a very routine manner with castles kingside, then knight h5 is actually very irritating. If the bishop drops back, then d4, that traps the bishop. So bishop e5, and then you can take knight for bishop, and then, well, either bishop h6 or, I mean, it doesn't really matter where that bishop goes actually. Basically, black has the two bishops, and I think probably it should be on one of these squares. Two bishops, centre, yeah, black should be a little bit better there. So white has to be alert, but Zhu was alert and she played bishop g5. Okay, and that bishop was knocked back. And now not bishop g7 because e5 wins material, but bishop e7 just solidly blocking out the bishop, just making sure there's no pin. And a5, yeah, very useful move. When you have this structure, you want to advance this to play a kind of minority attack against these queenside pawns. And Zhu develops very sensibly, rook in the middle. Knight d7, I mean, that's quite a pragmatic move. Wants to exchange bishops. I mean, if white wants to keep a bit of tension here, then perhaps bishop g3. But, you know, in this first game, Zhu obviously decided she wanted to play very solidly, maybe go for a slight advantage, trying to isolate this pawn. There were lots of exchanges. Now, got to take care of this bishop coming here. So queen e3, and now queen g5. Yeah, a very sound exchange. You want to try and induce f4 because that just slightly exposes the king along the second rank, along this diagonal. So Zhu exchanged queens and then exchanged on d5. It's even material. There's not a lot going on here. I mean, on a really good day, if white could plonk that knight on d4, blockading the bishop, then that would be the classic bad bishop. But even there, I think, because there are so few pawns on the board, black would be okay. But basically, Tan makes absolutely sure that white is not getting a hint of a bind and plays rook b8. Good move. So if the knight tries to get here, then of course knight b3 will be met by a4, and the b2 pawn drops. So therefore b3, okay, still a little hope of manoeuvring that knight to d4, but not after g4. So you can see that knight is rather controlled by the pawns. Knight f1, okay, targeting this one. That's the dream, but of course a4, the classic minority attack. That's why the a pawn was advanced. And this is just equal. There's not a lot going on. The game finished like this. Basically, all these pawns got exchanged. I mean, there are various ways to go about this, but this is actually very nicely played by Tan. There is no way this pawn is going to be held. This rook is potentially coming here, not just to a8. So Zhu has to be a little bit careful, but it burnt out to a draw. And h3, yep, just exchange some pawns. Very slight structural disadvantage for white, but of course, rook and 2 against rook and 2 is a stone cold draw. And there was a repetition, and that was that. Draw after 39 moves. Okay, not such an interesting first game. Tan, I think, played very solidly and avoided any problems at all. Let's move on to game 2. Here we go. Yeah, that seems to be working. Okay, so Tan Zhongyi, white in game 2, and she plays c4. I mean, she varies her openings a fair bit. With white, she plays e4, d4, c4, knight f3. So, I mean, I'm not sure c4 came as a surprise, but anyway, that's what we got. We got an English 4 knights. And of course, white can play here. Well, e3, d3, g3, they're all possible. g3 played. And Zhu decides to play d5. So basically, we've got a reversed Sicilian dragon. And knight b6 was always thought to be, well, almost obligatory, actually. And yeah, it's like a classical dragon, reversed. But bishop c5 in the last few years has come to prominence. I mean, it was always thought that there were sort of tricks here, but actually after knight e5, black can get away with this. After knight c6, queen f6, hits f2, hits the queen. This is the basic trick. So castles kingside instead. Castles, d3. I mean, we've seen this variation in the World Championship match. Carlsen Caruana, for example. But, all the top guys have played like this. h6. Okay, at some moments, black wants to play the bishop to e6, and that prevents a knight coming in. Knight takes, queen takes. I mean, it's a very sort of classical position, very stable position for both sides. Bishop d2. So at this point, Zhu decides to step away from the bishop. Bishop c3. Doesn't look like there's too much going on here. In a game between Caruana and Giri from this position, Giri played rook d8. That's reasonable. But queen e7 played instead. Okay, that's also seems all right. Not sure how necessary that is, but anyway, it's useful on the e-file because perhaps that knight is going to come here and there might be some pressure there. Excuse me. So knight d2 played. And black has a big choice. I mean, bishop e6 looks reasonable. Bishop g4 is typical to put a bit of pressure on the e2 pawn. But knight d4 played. Don't know. I'm not too keen on that move, actually. I mean, it's nice to plonk the knight on the outpost. And it's certainly great if that knight is exchanged off, because it'll open up the e-file. But here, e3 pushes the knight away. Now, this is Zhu's idea, to come to b5, to snap off this bishop. But after this, well, it's interesting. We have a similar pawn structure to the first game, with colours reversed. You know, white can play d4 and use this pawn which has moved into the centre. And it seems to me that white is very comfortable here. You know, I'd certainly prefer white. It's nice to advance that a pawn again. Really similar strategy. So you're pressing on these two pawns. And I think, you know, if white plays d4 here, knight c4, well, you know, I'd take white every time. You know, I can't see that black can do much on the king side. Whereas, you know, there's a little bit of pressure on the queen side. Reminds me a little bit of some trump positions, actually. But Tan played queen b3 straight away. I mean, of course, you can still come back to d4. Knight e4, hitting that one. The bishop dropped back. And now she exchanged on d6. Well, I think that makes life a lot simpler for black. Just kind of clarifies the situation. Okay, b6, yeah, getting rid of that potential weakness on b7 and exchange, and rook a7. Well, you know, white is still very slightly better. White has more active pieces. Nevertheless, you know, black is so solid here and very well coordinated. Doesn't seem to be an issue. I mean, one could exchange here, and if c takes, then b5. I mean, black starts to get the initiative. You know, this could be quite nice. That pawn coming to b3, controlled by the bishop, supported by the bishop. Or if e takes, then c5. You know, things are thinning out already. That looks like a sensible way for black to play. But rook c8 played, supporting that one. Rook b1. Again, I don't see what's wrong with b5 here, but bishop d5 played. So Zhu wants to tempt white into playing e4, and then that blocks out this one. And, well, could she be playing for the advantage? Well, maybe. I don't know. It's nice to block out that bishop. But Tan, very pragmatic, simply exchanged on e5 and played queen d4, seeking exchanges. And that's what happened. If c takes, then, you know, something like this. It's going to be a draw, basically. E takes, exchange on g2 and b5. I mean, Tan is still slightly better. You could say that rook is more active, but looks very solid. Rook e1, okay, take care. The rook wants to come to the 7th rank. Okay, so here is where Zhu has to switch on and think, how do I steer the game towards a draw? You know, it's clear that that's going to be the summit of black's ambition. So, for example, c5 looks very sensible. And if rook here, well, you can take. Okay, defend that one. And then, you know, white has to take care of this b pawn. And, you know, it's possible to attack that. I mean, that's one way to go. But rook a8. And the rook came down. Okay, so also looks reasonable to exchange a pair of rooks. So there's no problem on the 7th. And then c5. Just looking to exchange pawns. But this is a little bit different to the other variations we looked at, because the king is now able to support the d pawn. So Black has to just be aware of a few things here. Zhu played king f8. What about rook b8 instead? Just looking to support that pawn. And then, okay, the king steps forward, the pawn advances. Well, here this rook has to come back. So let's say rook a2. Now, no need to push on straight away. But f6, let's just bring the king out. So this rook is a little bit passive. King comes back, surrounding that pawn. But now black's king comes forward. Okay, so white wants to take here, but a check. And then king d5. Well, it's very hard to imagine that white is going to win this one. You know, the king is cut. I mean, this can be taken. So that was rook b8. I just think at this moment, it was probably a good idea to think, okay, how can I force a draw? How can I just put a little bit of pressure on white? But king f8, let things drift a little bit. Rook b7. Okay, that's behind the pawn. A check, but still fine for black. With a bit of pressure here, and check. Rook f3, king here. And now rook f5 was played, supporting that pawn. But it seems to me that rook b3 is a better move. Now it's still, it's not completely clear. I mean, white can play this one on, but still, I think this is a better way to go. And before these pawns advance, rook b2 check, take this one. I mean, this could be tricky, but it should be a draw. But in any case, rook f5 was played. And after this, well, the rook actually finds itself in a very unfortunate position. f4. And king e8 was played, and this is definitely a mistake. And in fact, b4 is the computer move, giving up that pawn and activating this rook again. But it's clear that something's gone wrong. Now, if you throw this into the gob of stockfish, then it spits out an assessment of equal. Well, it says it's going to be a draw anyway, in spite of white's extra pawn. But obviously white has chances here. You know, the rook can come back to cover, and then the king comes out. It should be a draw, but it's still not easy. So clearly it's gone wrong. But king e8, definitely a mistake. So the rook is attacked. If g6, then d5, this pawn is dropping. So rook f6 played, rook b5, hitting this pawn. This is a problem, because now the rook doesn't have time to switch round. g6, d5, and you can see that white has made fantastic progress. And the king is in trouble here. The combination of king, pawn and rook sets up really nasty threats. I mean, it's very typical for these rook and pawn endgames that you manage to create mating threats, basically. Check. The king was pushed back. Zhu played rook a2, looking for counterplay, but Tan played excellently here. She went for it with king c5, gave up the h-pawn. A rook check that just brings the rook to the 7th rank before the king comes in. Rook g7, good move, wants to take here. g5, now. You do not take the pawn because that allows black to simplify, but instead f5, and that ensures that there's another weakness in black's position. So you could say the first weakness is that, you know, white has the attack with king and pawn, and this is a second weakness. And this is a winning position. Still got to play carefully. So rook behind the pawn, h3, king d6. There we go. This is after the check, then the king is going to be forced away. And also the king can sometimes move over here. King b8. Now, be careful. King d7, that's a delicate move. It's a good move. If king e6, in fact, this would only be a draw. And the king steps over. So you can still mess up, basically. But king d7, this ensures that black's king is just way out of... well, can never get back in front of this pawn. And the king goes all the way. d7, h2. And here's a very important switch. Rook h3. So the rook is going to swing all the way across and then come down here. So this is what happened. King here, check. Now if the king steps up to c6, then king c8 and the pawn is going to go through. So king a7 and rook b2. So that ensures that this rook isn't moving. You just got to make sure that you don't allow a check here. And then the h-pawn would queen, but this is just lost now. So black just doesn't have a good move. King a6, rook e2. Good move. That shields the king. And king e7. And here, Wenjun resigned. Zhongyi takes the lead in the Women's World Championship match after 2 games. So that's a bit of a shocker. Many people saying Zhu was the clear favourite for this match. I mean, in fact, their ratings are very similar, both on pretty good form. So it's quite actually, on current form, quite even. But Wenjun has so much experience. Now, for fans of Wenjun, I should add that in her match let's leave the final position on the board. In her match against Lei Tingjie 2 years ago, Zhu also went 1 down. She was the first to lose a game in the match. So there's still a very long way to go. Saturday is a free day. They play game 3 on Sunday.